So the whole idea of this thank you tour is classic Donald Trump. Was the tour so that he could thank his voters, or was it so that they could thank him? I don't know, but in any case, the tour was very clearly only for his voters. Part of how you could tell was that he only traveled to states that he won. The first rally was in Ohio. Then there was another in North Carolina. Then he brought the tour to Louisiana. And he did it all again in Alabama. The president-elect spent his whole transition celebrating with only the people who voted for him. There was scarcely even lip service to the idea of being president-elect of the whole country, of all its people. It was actually the opposite. Now, predictably, this became a theme of his presidency. When the L.A. Times mapped all of the rallies Trump held in his first year and a half or so in office, the paper found that, quote, charting his stops yields a map that reflects his base, mostly red states and rural communities, a base that he hasn't tried to expand upon. And the president hasn't just rewarded his supporters with rallies. A few months into the Trump presidency, the Washington Post ran this headline, quote, Trump and Republicans bolster red states, punish blue. Since gaining control of Washington, President Trump and Republicans in Congress have pushed an array of policies that tend to punish states that voted Democratic in last year's presidential election, end quote. The Christian Science Monitor was even more blunt. Quote, President Trump's major policy moves over the course of his first year in office have had a common denominator. They either overtly favor his base of support, the roughly one-third of voters who solidly back him, or they appear to penalize those states that vote Democratic. Republicans say it stands to reason that Trump-era policies would favor his own party. To the winners go the spoils. All right, sure, all the administrations that we know about push policies favored by their own party. But when a presidency operates primarily on that premise, it can only struggle when the need actually arises for a national response to something. Last month, NBC News reported that the president's advisors were having trouble getting him to focus on any kind of response to the nationwide protests over the killing of George Floyd. Quote, these aren't my voters, the president has said repeatedly, dismissing protesters in discussions with aides about how to respond. In one tense meeting about how to respond to the unrest, Trump lamented that none of the protesters had voted for him. And this week, when the Washington Post went searching for answers as to why the president had not tried harder to tackle the coronavirus epidemic, one answer they found is that President Trump may not believe the virus is affecting people who matter to him. Quote, some aides and outside advisors have tried to stress to Trump and others in his orbit that before he could move on to reopening the economy and getting the country back to work and life, he needed to grapple with the reality of the virus. But until recently, the president was largely unreceptive to that message, they said, not fully grasping the magnitude of the pandemic and overly preoccupied with his own sense of grievance, beginning many conversations, casting himself as the blameless victim of the crisis. In the past couple of weeks, senior advisors began presenting Trump with maps and data showing spikes in coronavirus cases among, quote, our people in Republican states, end quote. And now we've got a new report suggesting that that worldview in the Trump White House, that there are our people and there's everybody else, that may have played a part in the deep sixing of an actual White House attempt at a unified national response to the coronavirus outbreak. There's been reporting over the last few months about a White House task force that was run by presidential son-in-law Jared Kushner. The task force was supposed to solve the shortage of COVID-19 testing in the United States, but was woefully unprepared for that task, in part because it was run by a guy whose leading qualification is being Donald Trump's son-in-law. But a new report from Catherine Eben at Vanity Fair gives a slightly different view of that debacle. Quote, 6 months into the pandemic, the United States continues to suffer the worst outbreak of COVID-19 in the developed world. Considerable blame belongs to a federal response that offloaded responsibility for the crucial task of testing to the states. The irony is that after assembling the team that came up with an aggressive and ambitious national testing plan, Jared Kushner then appears to have decided, for reasons that remain murky, to scrap its proposal. The plan, though imperfect, was a starting point. But no nationally coordinated testing strategy was ever announced. The plan, according to one participant, just went poof into thin air. Among the reasons? Quote, most troubling of all, perhaps, was a sentiment a member of Kushner's team reportedly expressed that because the virus had hit blue states hardest, a national plan was unnecessary and would not make sense politically. Let that sink in for a second. One public health expert in frequent contact with the White House told Vanity Fair, quote, the political folks believed that because it was going to be relegated to Democratic states, that they could blame those governors and that would be an effective political strategy, end quote. For the record, the White House says the premise of the Vanity Fair article is completely false. But now here we are.